us today for the third and last of our Community Perspectives talks that brings in locals to comment on topics, themes, and objects on view in our current exhibition, Changing Course, Reflections on New Orleans Histories. I'm Erin Greenwald, I'm Curator of Programs here at NOMA, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Clancy DuBos. Clancy's a political analyst at WWL-TV in New Orleans, specializing in local, state, and national politics. You've probably seen him on your televisions regularly. DuBos is also the political editor and columnist at Gambit, which publishes a weekly newspaper, and bestofneworleans.com. From 1991 until earlier this year, DuBos served as chairman and co-owner with his wife Margot DuBos of Gambit Communications, Inc. He began his journalism career at the Times-Picayune while in college in 1973, the same year as the UpStairs lunch fire. In 1981, he moved on to television as an on-air political reporter, analyst, and commentator, and more recently he edited Long Shot, A Soldier, a Senator, a Serious Sin, an Epic Louisiana Election, the acclaimed story of the 2015 governor's race by Tyler Bridges and Jeremy Alford. Please help me welcome Clancy DuBos.
Thank you. And for those of you in the doorway, if you want to come on in, can you hear me all okay? There's some background music, which seems to have gotten louder now that we're talking. But a couple of quick things. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, but I welcome questions at any time. So if you have a question, just sort of wave and let me know. I began my career as a journalist after my freshman year in college. I literally lucked into a summer internship at the Times-Picayune. I was all of 18 years old, literally and figuratively wet behind the ears. I started in May of 1973, which was not quite 6 weeks before the UpStairs lounge fire. I remember that night very vividly because while I've covered many stories since then, and a couple of big stories before then, that was one of those stories, it remains one of those stories for anybody who covered it that is just, this is maybe an unfortunate metaphor, seared or burned into your memory because of the scale of the tragedy. But I remember it being a Sunday night, and Sundays were always slow. Summers are slow, Sundays are slow, so a Sunday night in the summer is really, really slow. And at one point, the night city editor literally walked through the room. We were sitting around doing crossword puzzles and whatever. And he said, "Come on, somebody make something happen." And not 3 or 4 minutes later, the guy who monitored the police scanners at the time, because back then we had one guy there was always somebody whose job it was to monitor those scanners, came running into there screaming, "There's a fire in the French Quarter." And then and today, there's no such thing as a small fire in the French Quarter. Even if it is just a stovetop fire, it is a big, big deal because the French Quarter is, of course, sacred ground, but it's all cypress, it's a tinderbox. And so any small stovetop fire in the French Quarter has the potential to get out of hand. So he gave us the address. I jumped into a car with a photographer. The photographer drove. We ran every red light between the Times-Picayune building and Camp Street. At the time, we didn't have cell phones, and I don't even think we had walkie-talkies. We carried around nickels because that's what you would put into the phone to make a phone call at a payphone. And we turned on Camp Street because it was one way. Camp Street, if you know the geography of New Orleans, Camp Street becomes Charters. But we couldn't get across Canal Street, so we parked on Camp Street and ran to the site. And what I remember is about half a block or a little more, because this is on the corner of Iberville and Charters, the UpStairs lounge. We did not yet know what it was. We didn't even know that it was a lounge. So there's a fire on the corner of Charters and Iberville. So in that first block, I'm running there, and the Marriott Hotel is on my right, and a group of, cluster of buildings on Charter Street. If you turn around and look at that photograph in the corner. That's the upstairs line. So I'm running toward there down Charters, and I can see drops of blood on the sidewalk. Now, that could have been there from anything, but it sure looked fresh. And as I got there, if you look at this next photograph, I remember the gentleman on the right sitting on the curb, crying. And you can see it's hard to look at. Literally, his skin was burned off. And that's what you see there. And this is before they got to him. He was there by himself, crying, saying, "Somebody please help me." And I looked up, and I saw the image of Reverend Larson, who we did not know who he was, right here sitting. You know, the flames were still coming out, or some smoke was pouring out. I saw that. I will never forget that image. And I was literally 18 and a half years old. So I'm scribbling notes, you know, trying to decide yet, not that we decided, it had not yet been decided who was going to go where. But I kind of remember being at that scene for about 15 or 20 minutes. And I don't remember if I called in, because this is 45 years ago. And I had covered, by the way, I had covered stories about death before that. The first story I ever did outside of the office was the drowning of a 15-year-old child in what was then the flamingo pond of Audubon Park Zoo. This was before the zoo had been renovated into the beautiful world-class attraction that it is today. Back then the zoo was considered an animal slum. And this young boy was part of a field trip from one of the upriver parishes, like St. James Parish or somewhere. They came in to go to the zoo, and he wandered into the flamingo pond and fell in and couldn't get out and drowned. And that was in like my first or second week on the job. This was the end of my 6th week on the job. And so I thought I had been inured to death. Well, then I got to the upstairs fire. I was there about, like I said, about 15 minutes, and I was told to go to Charity Hospital and do what we call a sidebar story, a story about the scene there, because that's where everybody was being taken. And I think even the dead were being taken there. So I literally don't remember how I got to Charity. There was not a photographer with me. I think I ran there. You know, when you're 18 years old, you can run a mile and a half. It wasn't exactly palopitous, but it was, you know, I got there. And Charity then was not like it is today. There was no security. I just walked into the ER and kind of stood up against the wall like this with a notebook in my hand, just scribbling notes and trying to be unobtrusive, because I knew at some point they were going to tell me to leave. But they were so busy tending to the people there, they didn't have time to tell me to scram. So I was there for at least an hour. I was the only reporter there for much of that time. At one point I turned around and I saw Bill Elmer, who's a well-known, now deceased television newsman. He got in there. I had the whole place to myself as a reporter for about 45 minutes. And I described the scene in a story that I wrote later that evening. At one point I got to a cell phone, a payphone, and called in. They said, "Do you have enough?" I said, "Yes." And when I got back to the newsroom, I just sat at the typewriter, because we didn't have computers then, it was all typewriters. And we literally typed our stories on long sheets of newsprint. It was, instead of like 8.5 by 11 or 8.5 by 14, it was like 8.5 by 20. And back then, you know, if you have a computer, you know what the cut and paste option is. Well, it comes from the fact that we would cut and paste the paper if I had an insert. So I started typing my story, and it was just painting a picture of what it was like there. The main story was going to be about the fire and how many people and what time it started and when it was brought under control and what the sort. You know, I was just describing the Charity Hospital, and it ran on the front page next to the main story. And it talked about, you know, I think my lead paragraph says something like, a nurse in tennis shoes drew blood from a patient while an orderly mopped blood off the floor, and doctors raced about trying to tend to people. And it just talked about how they were triaging them. And I described it as a race. They were racing against time to see how many they could save. And the story ended with me saying something like, At the time, all the bodies and injured had been brought there that they could account for. The picture of the tragedy had come into focus. There were 29 people dead. Several people died a day or two later, and many more injured. And I just said the race was over. They had stabilized the people they could stabilize at that time. But it was really hectic. There was I described a young man who gave me a name that may not have been his real name, and I'll get into that in a minute. He got to the payphone and he had trouble. His fingers were burned so badly, it hurt him to put his hands in his pockets of his blue jeans. He got a nickel out and he asked me to put the nickel in the phone for him so he could dial the number. He dialed the number and he let me listen to his end of the conversation. He was crying, calling a friend. I think his name was David or his friend was named David. He was talking about that he was alive, but he was in a lot of pain, and he wanted to make sure his friend was okay. And scenes like that I was just a witness to, kind of a fly on the wall. Again, an 18-year-old kid. By then it had become that this was a gay bar. New Orleans was a very different place then. And I like to say that New Orleans is a city of contrast. It's a city of contradictions. We are a city of contradictions. Even then, throughout our history, New Orleans has always been known as, let the good times roll, the big easy. This is a place where you can go hang out and debauch and do whatever you want. And yet, at the same time, in the gay community, there was still very much the closet. Gay men who lived here were and felt they had to be very closeted. Their friends, their family might have known they were gay, but it was just we don't talk about that. And that's why a lot of the victims who survived gave different names, because they didn't want to be written up in the newspaper. Or even people who died, they had teenagers have fake IDs. So, what a contradiction. This is supposed to be a place where New Orleans is very tolerant. And we weren't, but we weren't. And think about the fact that of those who died, they could not be buried, or that they would not have, none of the churches, the Catholic Church, all the main denominations, nobody would give a funeral. The Archbishop didn't come out and express sorrow and extend condolences. There was, at one point, finally, St. Mark's Church. It's a Protestant church on Rampart Street. Wonderful. It's a church and it's a community center for all of the community. It's very inclusive. It always has been. They finally said, we can have the funeral here. And there's a statement about that on the wall over here that you should look at. In the middle of the service, one of the speakers said, I need to warn everybody, the news media is outside. And if you want to use the side entrance, you can. And somebody objected and said, you know what? I don't know, I wasn't there, but it was sort of like, it's time, the heck with that. Let's all just walk out together. And they did, they walked out together, arm in arm. And that is one of those moments, and there are several books that are written about this that frankly speak much more authoritatively on this subject than I can. But that was a moment where this fire, this tragedy, galvanized the gay community in New Orleans. And by the way, not everybody who died in the fire was gay. There was a mother there with two of her sons. She and both her sons died in the fire. So, the UpStairs Lounge was not just a bar. It was actually a meeting place, especially on Sundays. It was a place where the Metropolitan Community Church, which was a church that was very inclusive, it wasn't called LGBTQIA or anything like that back then. In fact, the sort of politically correct reference that the media would use, it was a bar frequented by homosexuals. And that's what they thought was the nice way to say it. At one point, the man a colonel, or a major rather, in the police department, who later became chief, said something like, well, this was a queer bar. And there were many things that were said, not quoted, but just around town. And I even heard some of these comments in the newsroom from some of the older rednecky types, you know, just saying it. They call it the fruit fry, you know, just horrible, horrible things. And people who were victims of this, who died, the people who were there, who got out, people who had loved ones there, and friends there, or acquaintances there. This was a turning point. And there were turning points like this all over America. There was a raid on a gay bar in New York that galvanized it, which was before this, that was sort of the initial spark of the gay rights movement. And this was the spark in New Orleans, but it didn't light right away. It kind of took a little while to catch on because, again, this city is so full of contradictions and is supposed to be so accepting, and we are on certain levels, but on other levels we sort of, we embrace our hypocrisy and we practice it. Say we as a city, that's what we did, because there was this closet. And as a young, these are observations I'm making from the perspective of 45 years. To go back to the night that it happened, my work week was Wednesday through Sunday. So that Sunday night was my Friday. So, and I worked on what was called the night shift from 2:30 to 11 at night. So that was, I did that story, and when there's a big event like that in the newsrooms all over the country, it's this adrenaline rush that you have because you're racing against time to get the story on the air or in print. We all went out for some beers afterwards and kind of exhaled and let the adrenaline drain from us. The next morning, I slept long. I was off. It was the summertime. I was in college, but it wasn't in summer school, so I slept late and got up and read the paper. And I remember going over to my girlfriend's house at the time. She said, "This was really terrible." And you know, when tragedy happens or when big events happen, like Katrina or anything else, you kind of steel yourself just to get through the moment. And you don't allow yourself to grieve, whether you've lost a loved one or just a storm comes through and you lose your house. You kind of, at least I do, I just sort of steel up and get my stuff together and get through the moment. And I do my crying later on. Well, that next afternoon when my girlfriend said, "This was a terrible, terrible thing," and I just put my arms around and started crying. That's when I finally said, I've never seen anything like this. And frankly, it opened my eyes to how the gay community and lesbian community was treated in New Orleans, but it took a long time for this thing to take root and take hold. And the media did not, you know, they covered it in a very ham-fisted, awkward manner, even when they tried to be diplomatic about it. The term politically correct wasn't invented then, but when they tried to be respectful, they just didn't know how. And I'm not excusing, I'm just saying this is just what it was. But slowly, you know, there were people who were angry in the gay community. Bill Rushton, who published a newspaper called Vieux Courier, was probably the leading advocate. He was, for his day, he was considered out there, but today he would just be right in the mainstream. So he was very much ahead of his time, saying, you know what, we're not going to take this stuff anymore. And started trying to sensitize people. But it took years, for example, for the Catholic Church to express condolences. And it took years for others to sort of just, you know, wait a minute, we're talking about human beings here, people we know, and it took years for many people in the gay community to feel comfortable to come out of what they called then the closet. And as a young cub reporter who worked only at nights, and I was off the next 2 days, the follow-up stories were given to other reporters, typically what I would call the dayside reporters. These are the senior people. And I was a kid, you know, I was only supposed to be there for the summer. As it turned out, by the time the summer ended, I got lucky enough that they offered me a chance to stay on. So I did that. I worked my way through college part-time, working at the Times-Picayune. So I had my job. Again, I'm living proof that it's better to be lucky than good. So, as an 18-year-old who was in college thinking about, you know, girls and beer, I didn't really follow the story that thought developed. So years later, I look back on it to the point where now I think I'm the last surviving reporter who actually covered the story. I know I'm the last one still working. The bylines that I see in the Times-Picayune that day, they're all deceased. And these guys are not that much older than I am, so I'm happy to give this talk and try to answer questions. But I confess, I was not covering the aftermath of it. But I read the stories and I've talked to people over the years who have been through it, and is there anybody here who is either a survivor or a friend or a relative of someone who either perished or survived the fire? Because there are many men in town who were there and who speak so eloquently and much deeper and more broadly than I can. But it took time. It took time. But the media and the community finally got sensitized to this. There are several books written about the UpStairs fire. The latest is one called Tinderbox, and it's written by a gentleman named Robert Fiesler. And he makes an observation in his foreword that great movements and momentous social changes always come at a price, and the price is usually in blood. It's not until people die that we get shocked into changing. Whether it's a revolution or a social movement like this, we have it's an unfortunate aspect of the human condition. Sometimes we have to get shocked into recognizing that we're wrong about something. This tragedy is one of those moments where the city had to get shocked into seeing that we needed to change how we treat one another and how we show respect to people as human beings, not as labels. Here we go. So I'll stop right there and take any questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Any questions or observations? Well, please go through and see the exhibit, and there are miniature books here that encapsulate what you see on the walls. And I'm going to hang out for a little while, so if you have a question later, feel free to come up and ask. Thank you.